Welcome back to Calling All Beings Thursday night with my party people, amigos and amigas. I'm your host, DJ, along with the co-creator, co-conspirator, executive producer, the money man himself in fun, entertaining, educational, interesting UFO, positive UFO talk for the community. Money Nathan, what's up, brother?
Wow. Greetings, everybody. Happy Thursday. Man, it's good. It's a good night for a podcast.
Especially with who the guest is. Because we're talking about somebody, brother.
I don't know much about him, but I've heard he's interesting, so very excited.
Fair.
Oh, man. This is a story in itself, and hopefully they'll detail that a little bit later. Also with us is the Keystone, the heart and soul, the original gangster, somebody we love very much, a study of UAPs. Debs, how you doing, homegirl?
I'm ready to get liminal.
Ooh, that was good.
Yeah, there's going to be, as we stated in our private chat, there'll be multiple polysyllabic words used tonight. Meredith, I know you're going to jump in there as well. Before we get to you, our homegirl from Mountain Idaho, where she's seeing apparently Bigfoot structures in the woods. Miss Primetime, Leah Prime.
Thank you, DJ. Yes, thank you. Thank you.
How's it going, homegirl? You all right?
Just another day in paradise. Thank you.
Literally. So we decided to bring on this special guest host. We wanted to get her in on an episode. I pitched this one to her. She is an amazing interviewer and intellect. She is the host of a podcast called Meredith for Real. She also does a bunch of stuff down there. She's, in Pensacola. People want to have her broadcast and speak about a bunch of stuff. So, Meredith for Real, what's up, homie?
What's up? I'm so happy to be here. Happy solstice too. A couple days late. One day.
Namaste. Just in the beginning, Meredith was so funny, man. She's just. I'll tell you what, man. And I'll be on with her on Monday. We're going to record a show.
I'm super excited about that.
I'm gonna be serious.
So
I'm
excited.
Take off my glasses.
And then you have to push up your intellectual invisible glasses in the center anytime you're about to say something very scholastic.
I will. I'll do that. And also like Anjali, she does the throat clear every time she's about to get into it. So
I had a college professor that said anytime I clear my throat, that means you should take notes. So that's probably a good move.
Right. The old foot stomp, as we used to say in the Air Force. But without further ado, let's introduce our special guest. This man came on the show and subsequently became Nathan's brother. And we now have to share Nathan between a bunch of us. What are you going to do? He's a wanted man. He is the communications director of the John E. Mack Institute, a graduate of the Monroe Institute's Gateway program. This man is a desired and wanted speaker on the UFO conference circuit because of his incredible thoughts and his mind, which drew all of us to him, frankly. He's not only the host of one, but two celebrated podcasts, one being the Point of Convergence, which is how Nathan said, we got to get this guy on during our first show meeting. And the one that he and Nathan started together, which is called Liminal Phrames. He is the king of ontology, ufology, phenomenology, and his favorite word, whatnot. So party people, put those hands together for Darren, Exoacademian King! Yeah! Woo! Exo, baby!
Do that introduction. I'm sure of it. I'd like a recording afterwards. Thank you.
Yes,
I think
sir.
you should make it your new ringtone on your
Absolutely.
phone. Every time your phone rings, you just hear DJ's voice pumping you up.
That's right.
We're going to get it to you, brother. And before we go any further, I pitched this to Nathan the other day about a North Carolina ufology keg party. at your cabin, which would include yourself, obviously Nathan, Micah Hanks, who will probably bring some sort of a moonshine, and Dr. Diana Pasulka. Like, why shouldn't this keg party happen? Maybe even Christopher Bledsoe.
And
right?
Should there be CE5 as well? I'm guessing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean,
Of course.
this should happen. Just keep Nathan. Nathan's going to have that little thing. You're going to be trying to get.
It is Appalachia, so we got some moonshine too, probably. So just a heads up.
Now, based on DJ's interest, he should keep his eye on the window back there, just in case Sasquatch makes its way across the window. You know?
Exactly.
Keep an eye out.
Darren, you are going to have a sighting. I mean, this is going to happen.
All right.
Have you
I'll
any
share.
doubt?
I have not seen any yet. No, I'm sorry. Lots of squirrels, lots of deer, not any Sasquatch yet.
Just try putting out some kibbles of dog food. This will happen. But anyway.
Okay. Fair enough. Lots of ballards. Okay.
The first question I have for you, Darren, and I don't want you to feel any pressure with this question, but resting on the results of your answer could be conferral of some sort of a honorary PhD from Dr. Jeff Kripal. So let me just, put that frame up there. What would you say are your favorite potato chips? Are we talking about sea salt? Are we talking about a seasoned potato chip? And I won't codify it any further and see what your answer is and if it marries up with Dr. Kripal and some of the other PhD's answers.
Yeah, I should have checked with Jeff beforehand. I had no idea this was going to be the question. I put a barbecue at number one with sour cream and onion being a close second.
Wow. Okay. All right. Wow. Nathan.
New data points.
Well, keep track. Okay.
So yeah, I mean, you would have, in order to qualify for the honorary conferral of the PhD, you would have to have said polychip, which is where both. Yep, you're there, Leah. What was the other PhD we had on? Sean Esbjorn Hargens, and Dr. Kripal, both polychip. So I'm sorry, Darren, you're going to have to remain at this level.
Next time.
Next time. Yeah. So anyway, I wanted to ask you, Darren. We're kind of going. We're going to try to be relatively brief. We have a lot of people to get to tonight, so I'm going to try to all of us, sort of get to the point with these, except for you. And then I wanted to ask you, based on what happened with Mr. Grush and the revelations that he came forward with, a lot of which I think everyone on here has heard through the grapevine at one point or another, most of it, if not all. The beings that have given you downloads that you're in contact with, have you heard anything regarding that revelation, if you will, since it happened?
Wow, that is a penetrating question. I feel discombobulated. No, I'm just kidding. I have to use that word at least 3 times in the interview.
Polysyllabic, it's good.
What I would say is that my sense of things is that the timing is not unconnected. It's all somehow connected. So the things that are happening in the world, the challenges we're facing as a civilization, the push towards disclosure, the increased activity amongst different groups happening in the world right now, I'd say it's all connected. That's my answer to that question.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, and let's pass it over to, without further ado, Money Nathan, take it away.
All right, so Darren, I'm just going to hit you with some.
What's your name again? Sorry.
Yeah, so I'm Nathan. I'm with Calling All Beings.
Hi, Ethan. How are you doing?
Just my first time. All right, I'm going to put you in the hot seat here because I think this will be a good one. Right. I read a comment online, and you're going to love this. I read a comment online about you and your show, Point of Convergence, and the commenter said, I really love Point of Convergence until Darren did the CE5, and then he went all woo, and then this commenter got turned off. So I have a 3-parter here for you, all right? 1, I want your reaction to that. But 2, I want you to kind of, what do you consider woo to be? And 3, why should we be paying attention to the woo?
All right. So the first question was, what do I think about that question, right?
Yes.
Or that comment? Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, my commitment is to wherever the data leads, wherever my experience leads. I'm not going to cover something or not cover a certain angle because someone doesn't like it. you're going to end up offending someone somewhere. If you're not offending anyone, you're probably doing it wrong. It's kind of my perspective. My experience in exploring this phenomenon, both in terms of from an academic point of view and looking at all of the historical data, experiential literature, and my own experiences with CE5 and the Heist protocols and psychedelics and meditation and everything else, have just exposed me to the woo. And once you've gone down that avenue, it becomes impossible to separate the two, I would say. I think anyone who's not seeing woo, as our conventional culture might want to call it, in the phenomenon data is either not looking very deeply or somehow has such a deep bias that they're just sort of excluding it from their perspective. In terms of how I define the woo, see, that's the thing. I don't really think it's woo. I think it's actually part of reality. It's just that we have too narrow a liminal frame, you might say. What was the last part of the question?
Why should we be paying attention to it?
Why should we be paying attention? For the reason I just said, because it's in the data. You can't deny it. You can't separate these two out. Going back to Vallée and John Keel back in the 60s and 70s, they recognized it back then. They began thinking this was just about the extraterrestrial hypothesis, something about space aliens, fairly simple, fairly astronomical, much more complex than that once you look at the data and once you actually explore it on your own.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's funny when you talk about podcast comments. I think Nathan should have a look that in the Apple comments, there are two of them that are basically saying, Nathan, you're great, but you should get rid of that loudmouth DJ. And the other one is very similar. It's like, this show would be awesome. Nathan, you just got to rid yourself of that other guy.
I just delete those and move on, man.
So thank you, everybody, for those very encouraging comments. Nathan may consider it. You don't know. Anyway, Debs, please go ahead, ma'am.
Okay, so there's this term that you use, ontological shock, that has been picked up. Of course, it's not, I know it's not one you coined, but it is one that you use to explain what's going on. And as of the Grush drop, essentially, I've seen ripples and shock, even among the members of the UFO community. And a lot of people are saying that they're afraid. So I just wanted to know what you would say to them to help them deal with that shock and that fear.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's a question we'll be facing more and more on a daily basis almost as this gets more traction in the mainstream. The ontological shock relates to the fact that it's not just something a little bit beyond what you're expecting to come across. Like, for instance, one time I ran into a mountain lion on a mountain trail, not here, but somewhere else in the West. That was shocking, but it wasn't ontologically shocking because it's possible that you're going to meet a mountain lion on a hike. This is something you expect within your ontological framework. But what people encounter with this phenomenon is beings that should not exist. We're not talking just about lights in the sky or even craft in the sky. I know people personally that were, for instance, part of the people that were involved in the research that Dr. Mack did in the 90s. And these people had gray aliens, or what they perceived as gray aliens, at the end of their bed suddenly, shockingly, no invitation, doors were locked, doors were closed, windows were closed, and yet they're suddenly at the end of the bed, and they're pressing down on the bed. You feel the weight, you can feel the heat when they're so close to your face. So these are shocking because they are both rooted in physical reality somehow. We don't know how. That's part of the investigation we need to do. And they somehow don't fit with any of our usual understanding of what can be and what kind of beings exist. So that's when you run into ontological shock. In terms of how I would help people dealing with that, I think support and community are essential. So there's various different groups you can reach out to now, thankfully, unlike in the 90s, where you can join a bunch of other people who've had similar experiences, find out that you're not crazy, that this is something that does happen. Thankfully, one thing that is coming out of all this in terms of our push towards disclosure is just becoming more normalized all the time. And there's an understanding now, unlike in the 90s, that this is something that can happen. So I would say reach out to community. If people are rejecting what you're saying, are calling you crazy or not being supportive, then find people who can be, because they do exist out there. And that's essential to be able to ground the experience.
It's a great way to frame it up. It's basically the same reaction people have to Bigfoot. When they see it, they'll try and explain it away. It's a bear. It's this. Did I really hear that? What could that be? What else has the digits where they have an opposable thumb and can grab a rock and throw it at you? In the forest, you basically have a human or you have Bigfoot. So, but people will, rationalize it away. Go ahead, Miss Primetime.
All right. It's Bigfoot all the way down. So Darren, one of my favorite things about your work is just how highly interdisciplinary it is. This is the approach I've generally favored as well, coming from the perspective of psychedelics, exotic consciousness, spirituality, spiritual emergence, etc. So I'm always very curious about when we're considering outside the field of ufology or outside the subject, if you could discuss what thinkers or works you think get it or have influenced your perspective or approach.
Sure. Yeah. And I do agree with you fully that an interdisciplinary approach is essential. What I did a couple of years ago was when I recognized that the data just didn't fit with our conventional models of reality, rather than just trying to cram it in or exclude it and pretend it didn't exist, I went looking in other disciplines, other academic disciplines, to see if there was research being done, data that was being discovered that could support some other avenues we could pursue. And you do find that both in neuroscience and quantum physics, in philosophy, for instance. So Bernardo Kastrup is someone that's really influenced me in terms of an idealistic approach to a metaphysical sort of undergirding of reality, that reality is primarily mental, and the physical reality we perceive is more like a dream state that we experience, but ultimately everything is mental. And once you allow for that, then suddenly all sorts of things that you wouldn't normally consider part and parcel with what we consider physical reality become possible. Donald Hoffman's work has been another central piece for me, because, especially when you tag those two together, because Hoffman has helped point out how what we actually experience in terms of what we think of as reality, what we experience with reality, and all of us share in common, is actually more like a desktop interface, as I know many of you know. And we are, each other are like icons on a screen for each other. So when you suddenly think about beings that are not supposed to exist suddenly showing up in our world, in our bedrooms, think of it less like a being is coming into physical reality, which we know is the base of reality, and rather look at it like someone's just dropped a file remotely onto your computer screen. How did they do that? There's ways we know that you can do that. So they somehow are able to work at the substructure, the substrate of what we perceive as physical reality. And so that really helps to explain what's going on, because suddenly you realize that there's a big difference between assuming what we experience is the root of reality versus seeing it as some sort of, not even just a truncated version of the total reality, but a full translation into a shortcutted interface with icons to allow us to survive and perpetuate the species, rather than being a pipeline to ultimate truth. So when you recognize that that's actually what we're perceiving, even though we are deluded into thinking it's not, and then you realize that beings that could be thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of years in front of us in terms of their understanding, not just of technology, but of the nature of consciousness and the substrate of reality, then they can perhaps work in the structures below our perceptual framework that we think of as reality. And when they can do that, then it explains why a lot of its seemingly impossible feats can be accomplished.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, I was thinking about, my mind went to the block universe for a second, but I want to introduce you to our special co-host tonight, the host of Meredith for Real, and an amazing interviewer herself, Meredith. This is Darren, Exoacademian.
Darren, I am so excited to hear from you. And I love what you were just saying about that reality is more mental than physical. I saw your tweet about that. And in the tweet, you say also that is evidenced by psychedelic research. And as someone who just had her first mushroom trip 2 weeks ago, I am very interested in your interest in psychedelics. And I want to know what you perceive is the connection between psychedelics and the whole alien subject.
Excellent question. Congratulations on your first trip, by the way.
Thank you.
Have many more.
Thank you.
Yeah, for instance, just to share with the group, I recently had my first DMT trip. I was in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, where it's
Mazel
completely
tov.
legal, you know. So
Yes.
I'm not going
Congratulations.
to get me in trouble here. I would say that one thing I want to say about that tweet about psychedelics and how it actually points to perhaps the mental substrate of reality versus the physical nature of reality is because when we look at comparing people's experiences on psychedelics versus what we see in a brain scan while they're having those experiences, according to physicalism, if they're having the most mind-blowing experiences of their lives, which many people describe, then we should see a brain that's lit up. We should see a brain that corresponds to that kind of lit up experience. And yet we see the opposite. We see a brain that looks remarkably dormant while people are having the most mind-blowing, vibrant, more real than real experiences of their entire lifetime. So that doesn't plumb well in terms of those two. It speaks more to support for idealism, for the sense that perhaps there's a consciousness substrate to reality rather than the physical one. Now, in terms of how it relates to the alien beings and the phenomenon in general, I think, again, we're talking about ways that we can perceive greater reality beyond our sort of evolutionarily derived interface, right? So I think psychedelics are one way we can get out of that and actually experience more of reality. Not less, not alt reality, but actually more of reality. And the same thing happens when people are in contact with the beings. They often feel like it feels more real than real. They have a sense of it being a broader sense of what really is rather than here. Many people come back from those experiences not really wanting to leave that experience. Similarly, you find the same thing with near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences. So you have all these different contact modalities, is what Ray Hernandez called them, where they seem to speak to this common ground in terms of experiencing more of the actual total reality. And furthermore, what's really interesting in terms of a data point is that if you've experienced any one of those, you come back, you're more likely to have the other ones as well than someone from the general population. It's almost like some sort of switch gets flipped on in your consciousness that makes you more able to have those experiences. And sometimes people have permanent changes, like they begin to be precognitive. They have dreams about the future, things like that. And each of those different modalities can trigger that. So somehow it is all related. That's why I called my podcast Point of Convergence, by the way. That was the root of the name. And somehow it points to something fundamental about reality being much more than what we usually experience in our waking state, sort of consensus reality. And that question, that topic is what I'm most interested in, actually.
It's so fascinating to view reality as non-linear. Like when you're talking about the brain quieting down, my first thought was Dr. Bruce Grayson's research on, near-death experiences. So I got so excited when you mentioned that, because that's what his research saw as well. And it was surprising to him, especially as a very, hard-lined atheist scientist. So that's very, very cool. I now see the connection between nonlinear thinking and, being able to conceptualize different dimensional beings and, as you said, realities. That's pretty cool.
Well, if I could just tag on to that, one of my experiences that I've had in various kinds of experiences, in meditation, in contact with different kinds of intelligences, and on psychedelics, is more of a multidimensional kind of awareness, where when I'm sort of coming back to this sort of consensus reality, I can feel it narrowing. I can feel like some of the information is like falling by the wayside, because there's no way you can channel that much multidimensionality into a narrow linear experience. So I think that is something to make note of, again, that speaks to the fact that actual reality is much broader and deeper and more multidimensional than what we usually experience. And I also have found that my experience of time is very different in those kinds of states as well. Sometimes it feels like, I had experience recently on the weekend, actually, that felt like I was actually getting glimpses of my own future. And it's interesting because there's been research by Dean Radin and some different people that point to this, that sometimes we don't necessarily get a view of the future in terms of the global state, but often of our own consciousness, we often can. So that's very interesting. For instance, someone might not know what's going to happen 10 days from now, but they might have a precognitive dream where they see themselves looking at a newspaper 10 days from now, and they see a headline that ends up coming true 10 days from now. So there's something about, again, our experience and us being multidimensional beings, us being much more than we think of as ourselves being here. And sometimes in those alternate states, we can tap into that broader sense of who we are, which I think is also one of the X factors in the phenomenon question in general, because we are much more than we realize here. And I think that's something we'll discover as we learn more about the phenomenon as well.
Darren, in that future did you notice if you still had hair or not?
I did, as far as I could tell, but to be honest with you, I'm seeing through my eyes, so I didn't come across a mirror, so I just assumed, to be honest with you.
Not that I'm rooting for you not to have hair. I just want to make that clear to the whole panel here.
Strangely, I saw you and you had hair, so I'm not sure what is going on there.
So, Darren, your first experience though was really before you sought to, knew how to put yourself in a state to have contact, which you have that now. But your first contact experience, what you were not seeking contact. I believe it was in a hotel room, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
Indeed. And while some people go to hotel rooms for contact, that's not what I was doing.
You see, people don't know that Darren's funny. That's why we brought him on Cab. There's a whole new avenue, people. Him and Nathan both, they're sneaky, damn funny. So, all right, let me, because really that area, I could get into some more inquiry, but I want to make sure that everybody gets around. What I would ask you, Darren, is in these messages that you've received, is there a message that you've received that you found very surprising and a message perhaps that you found not surprising at all?
Well, I would say the part that was the least surprising of all was only because of my background. So I have a background in Buddhism and non-duality. I went through a long period of sort of identifying as a Christian too, but then moved into non-duality and sort of Eastern spirituality, Vedantic kind of traditions. And so non-duality, the connection between everything being an aspect of source, us all being like leaves on the central tree that is the sort of cosmic source, or God, if you prefer that word, you can handle the baggage. That was my leaning already. And everything I experienced in those experiences confirmed that to a T. So much so that you experience everything as just more alive and more connected. And you sense how everything we do, every action we take, every thought we have interpenetrates with everything else. And not just in this reality, but in other dimensions as well. And so perceiving that made me much more aware of and wanting to be cognizant of my own actions and my own thoughts, because I was aware of the implications being much wider than I originally thought. In terms of what has surprised me, that's a good question. I think, just how much more real that feels actually in that state. It's weird to come across someone who says, well, how do you know that's not just a dream? How do you know that's just some sort of delusion you're having? The people who have had those experiences like myself, it feels so real that you just don't question it. And when each of us thinks about what do we really look to in terms of authority of how we define what is most real to us, what we most trust, it's some sort of sense like that. It's some intuitive sense. It's not some logical rationale we come to. It's a heart sense, something somatic rooted in our bodies. And that was my experience there, which makes me think about this supposed reality very, very differently. And I think of it as a kind of a conditional reality, more like a stage with which consciousness can progress and learn and whatnot. And so I kind of, carry on my affairs that way once I'm here.
It's interesting that, people will say, well, how do you know you can believe David Grush? And I'll say, there's a whole lineup of things of why I confer credibility upon him. And in the same way, people would say, well, how do you know what Exo is saying, these experiences have, I think, because I believe him. I confer that belief upon him based on not only your association with Nathan, but just what I know about you and other people. And when I hear you, I believe you. I don't need to see a videotape of it, just like I don't need to see a videotape of back-engineered craft to believe that that's happening. So that when people kind of wonder, like, where does belief come from? It comes from within you and your interaction with another person. Every one of us have heard experiencers and we're like, yeah, this person is making that up. And we've heard people be like Ian Doley, and you're like, wow, or yourself. Yeah. So anyway, let me pass it over to the capable hands of your brother, Money Nathan.
Yeah, I got a lot of directions I want to go just with the conversation here, but so many interesting avenues to pursue. One that I wanted you to touch on, though, is the human experience. I think a lot of times when we talk about meditation or altered states, I think some people can conflate that with the diminishing of the other aspects of what it means to be a human being. And of course, you and I have talked about several times the accounts of other intelligences, kind of lack, at least to our awareness, the sort of cultural depth that you and I are used to in human society. So what is it about being human, in your opinion, that is particularly special?
Well, one of the interesting ways I would answer that question is that it partly depends which era of humanity you're speaking of, because I think there's a lot of evidence. I lean more and more towards a significant component of the phenomenon is actually us from the future. So in that sense, you have different eras of human existence in which our relationship with reality, with culture and whatnot changes. And what's interesting is as we progress along that track, we find that actually there's more and more of a felt sense of being connected to a whole. So you get to this point where you have basically this felt sense as being a collective civilization, a collective consciousness as a civilization. I've had experiences where I'm tuning into something about myself that feels connected to that collective consciousness, and yet I still have a sense of I-ness, but it's more like a we-ness in that kind of case, which really makes me again think about differently about this reality and think differently about myself as a small self ego kind of thing. I also think when you have that kind of collective consciousness, then there's so much shared interiority between the different beings in that consciousness that a lot of the culture happens on an interior basis. So we don't see so much maybe color and vibrance and flavor and texture and that kind of thing externally when people are on the ships and whatnot. But internally, all of that is still there. And because you also have a different relationship with time, you can experience any and all of those different eras of humanity at the same time. So I think that fundamental nature of humanity is still there. But I do think, as you and I have talked about on Liminal Phrames, there also is a bit of a trade-off that at some point it seems like there's evidence leaning towards the fact that at some point our future descendants made some decisions about how they were going to relate with each other and with the earth, perhaps recognizing that some of our emotive nature actually doesn't serve us so well. And so there's this move towards a more clinical way, a more Spock-like way, if you will, of seeing the world, more logic-based rather than so emotive. And in doing so, actually, perhaps they recognize that they lost something along the way. I know we've talked about this. And so I think part of what may be happening with things like the hybridization programs that are so well documented in the literature, I think you may see some of that rescuing of things that were lost along the way. So I think that's a really interesting question. What is it about their nature that we would really want to draw from? And what perhaps have they lost along the way that they could gain by working with us and perhaps even creating hybrid species with us?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's a great topic. I actually heard Kelly Chase speaking with Michael Masters about it, and we also discussed it on this program about them taking biological material, reproductive material from men and from women, and there obviously must be a reason why they're doing that. So let's pass it on to Debs. Please, go ahead, ma'am.
Yeah, so someone on Twitter had asked us to ask this question, and I was curious as well. You had recently mentioned that you had, of course, known about the Five Eyes working on this topic in the past. I also am familiar with a lot of the history of international relations, but I thought maybe you could talk about that for people who are wanting clarity.
Sure. So first of all, I think we shouldn't be surprised that because Five Eyes exists, that there would be a sharing of information amongst the different nations, especially because we know that crash retrievals have not been limited to the United States territory. So either the United States tries to go in heavy-handed and say, hello, Canada, hello, Australia, please give us your craft. Rather than doing that, there was more of a cooperative approach. Of course, most of it has happened inside the US, but these other countries have also had their own crash retrievals. So this is one thing I pointed out too in some of my social media tweets recently, was that we have to remember that these things are worldwide. They go back a long time, longer than has sort of recognized in the modern UFO phenomenon. And I also want to point out to people, and I've tweeted about this before because I have some knowledge about this specifically, that unlike in our country, where we sense that there's perhaps been illegal activity, where there's been reverse engineering of these craft done in such a way that there was no congressional oversight, so that's been passed on to contractors and whatnot. In some of these other countries, that's not been the case. They've done it fully legally, in the light of day to some degree. And I'm aware of personally countries that have actually gone looking for evidence of these programs and found them almost immediately, interestingly enough. And then it becomes a much less complex question than what we have here, because here we're trying to uncover decades of secrecy and layers of bureaucracy that are cut off from other layers, and the extreme siloing of information. That's less complicated in some other countries. And so I think we may even begin to see some of these other countries, as we've seen hints of recently, leapfrog the US in terms of beginning to push for disclosure. I also know that because of the communication between the Five Eyes and whatnot, that there was awareness that the summer of 23 was going to be a big time for disclosure, for revelations to come forward that would really, really change, at least potentially, society's perspective on this phenomenon historically. And so because of that, I know some different countries that were working towards prepping their own material, so how they could actually go about briefing their governments and then also the public. So this has been something that's been in the works for quite a while now. And I was actually involved in some of that. So I know that it's gone on. You'd be surprised sometimes who certain people reach out to try to understand this when it's not something that's well understood within some governmental circles. So that's kind of how I have some insight into that.
I'm not surprised at all, actually. So thank you for that answer. Prime time.
Awesome, thank you. So one of the things I'm really interested in is how people choose or deliberately pursue to induce contact experiences. So my question here is basically two parts. The first are just your general thoughts or response to people's deliberate pursuit of these experiences. And then the second question is what you recommend for people to integrate these experiences or sort of metabolize them and fold them into, I guess the broad cloth of lived experience.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that it's worth giving a broad answer to that, a multidimensional answer, if you will, because I think one of the questions that is bantied about a lot is CE5 safe? Is heist safe? Is this something everyone should do? Are you guaranteed to have a love and light kind of experience?
Right.
And while the data would suggest, again, I always encourage us to look at the data and not just go with our gut instinct, which is full of bias. The data seems to suggest that the vast majority of experiences are positive. That said, I still think one of the things that we see as a data point emerge from these kinds of encounters is that the energy you sort of see the project with, the endeavor with, ends up being reflected back to you to some degree. There's been some questions around some of the supposedly negative things that have happened at Skinwalker Ranch, for instance. Is that because in the past, military groups have gone in with kind of a military kind of perspective in terms of engaging a threat or an enemy potentially, and how is that reflected back? I don't think it's quite as simple as that, as cookie cutter as that, but there is an element of that. So I think when people go out to do CE5 or heists, you want to be aware of who you're going with. You don't want to go with people who are being flippant about it, people who are almost daring something negative to happen or something like that, like, a bad Ouija board experience or something.
I was just going to say it's like getting drunk and doing a Ouija board with a bunch of EHAs.
Right, exactly. So you want to go out with people that you respect, you trust, you feel connected with. A big part of what makes CE5 work is when you have a resonant field with the group you're going with. So you don't want to go ideally with a bunch of strangers. I know different CE5 communities around the country who actually, when they have new members come in, they kind of normalize them into the community. They have dinners with them, they meet with them, they have coffee, they talk long before they invite them into the field to actually become part of the group, because they're actually looking for that resonant field, that are they a good fit or not. And then when you go out, you want to be very focused on having a positive intent yourself. You want to hold positive energy, knowing that, again, that seeds the experience. You're much more likely to have a positive, benevolent entity pick up on the other end if you're dialing a number, even unconsciously, a certain way, right? So you want to be aware that your energy is going to seed the experience, which also means you want to be self-aware. You want to have nurtured self-awareness, that you're aware of the sort of resonance in your body. If you have a lot of negativity, a lot of fear, a lot of anger, frustration, maybe that's not the night to do it. If in general, you're someone who has a lot of fear and anything to do with the unknown actually freaks you out, then you might want to do some work on that before going and doing CE5, just because you don't know what you're going to invite. So I think that's the case. And when you go and actually have the experience and hopefully have a positive experience like most people do, then I think, for me, for instance, one of the most interesting aspects is the kind of telepathic downloads you get afterwards. It's not the actual seeing the lights in the sky doing strange things. It's the way that actually it interacts with your own consciousness. So I would say to people, be aware of that, look for it, be listening for it, for any kind of differences you experience. And then also, I would say, embrace the wonder of it, the awe that you feel that reality and our cosmos is so much more complex and multidimensional than when we've usually given it credit for. And hopefully that will make people feel the sense of wonder, connectedness, not just with these beings, but with each other. And ideally, it changes how you live your life moving forward.
Yes. Yeah, this is a wonderful answer. And I ask particularly because in my opinion, one of the major shortcomings right now of the psychedelic renaissance basically is having very poor cultural and social narratives for how to integrate and metabolize kind of otherworldly or numinous experiences. And I think of Heist or CE5 as part of that kind of constellation of experience that we can have that can kind of refactor how we understand and engage with reality and meaning and sense making, and without like just kind of shoving people into these experiences without any kind of outlay about how to process and integrate can be deeply traumatic, right? It does way more harm than good. And so I'm always very curious about people's approaches to making sense in sort of the post-experience time frame and folding it into like basically into daily life. So it's not just a standalone experience, but something that's fully kind of metabolized and understood.
Totally, I completely agree. When you think about sometimes people might go to a music festival to escape their normal life, right? I know that Nathan and I are familiar that in church circles, you sometimes get people, at least in the more charismatic kind of elements of the church, you get people who go to, these different festivals so they can get like an experience with the Holy Spirit, and they want to get filled up and they have this intense experience. And then they go back to their normal life on Monday. They got to wake up, they go to work, they got to chop wood, that kind of thing. And so
carry water.
Exactly. There you go. Here's my thought. And they sort of collapse internally because they've just gone from this peak experience and they have no ability nor teaching nor expectation that they should somehow ground that into the nature of their experience of reality in general. So, and same thing when we come to psychedelic experiences and things like that. If people are trying to trip merely to escape the mundanity of their daily existence, then I would say that's the wrong way to go about it. You want to expose yourself to a broader sense of reality so you can then integrate it and carry on differently as a result. So I think why you're going into it really matters. And I completely agree with you that in some subcultures, it's kind of too flippant in terms of how it's approached.
Mm-hmm.
Hey guys, I want to, there's a lot of questions in the chat. Nathan, what I think I want to do is after Meredith goes, we'll start the fireside portion. And then we'll at the end, what I'll do is take Julie in the chat. Hi, Julie, has starred all these for us. I'm going to start with Duncan's when we do get going, but I think we should have Darren do some quick hitters at the end with these questions because some of them are great and they're detailed, but I think we got to get to the fireside portion. Does that sound good?
Perfect.
Okay. All right. Let's go with Meredith for Rizzle.
Can I just say how cool this chat is, Darren? I am so geeking out right now on everything that you were saying. I'm so stoked to be here and to hear you talk. And now that I can hear you talk more about how the experiencer integrates these new revelations and new way of seeing their reality into their life, I'm totally seeing the connection between psychedelics. But had I not had my first experience a couple of weeks ago, I probably would have just been faking it. Like, I totally get it, but I wouldn't. I'd be totally faking it. But I do want to ask you about the spiritual communities, the religious communities, because in my evangelical community 25 years ago, to talk about aliens and UFOs and all this stuff, at its best, it would have been seen as not like a good use of time. It would have been like, oh, you're watching trash TV. Like, come on, sister, don't do that. But at its worst, it would have been, really, borderline blasphemous. But now that we've got these mainstream media outlets talking about it, perhaps it's gained a little bit more legitimacy, and who knows, maybe they're talking about it from the pulpit. But my question for you is, I'd love to know your prediction on the contrast between how the evangelical community versus the Catholic community will react to a national first contact scenario.
And Nathan, pick that up too after Darren's done. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a great question. I've had quite a range of religious experience, not only in moving towards more Eastern spirituality more over the last 10 years or so, but even within my sort of Christian phase, which is still a part of who I am, of course. I've been everything from a Pentecostal, charismatic Pentecostal, to Vineyard Church, to Southern Baptist, to Methodist to Presbyterian. I mean, I just sort of like, I made sure I covered like every single, angle I could.
How thorough of
Poo
you.
platter at the Chinese restaurant. You got egg rolls. You have the spare ribs.
Yeah, that's right.
You have the mushu pork.
Yeah. So it's interesting, even within Protestant communities, how much range there is in terms of people's experience, their expectation of experience, and even the role of scripture, for instance, in their lives really varies, even amongst just those Protestant groups, which is really interesting. I also spent time in Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism, so I'm familiar with those too. I really love how Eastern Orthodoxy has this sense of the numinous and the sacredness and the mystery, the sacramental nature of reality and our experience of the divine. I love that. In many ways, that prepared me for some of my experiences more recently. In terms of how it will be handled, I think what's happened with the evangelical community in the United States over the last 20 years has been kind of shocking in some ways, how it's been kind of aligned with politics in so many ways. And so there's kind of been this move towards making religious experience about looking towards a book. And as I've said to Nathan before, when you look towards a book, you're able to make it safe, predictable, and something that is in the past, right? So you have this sense of these religious figures that we look up to in the past had these amazing experiences, but we don't expect that for ourselves. We just look to them. Now we have the revelation in the book, and we just rely on that. But of course, one of the reasons why I think that happens is that some people that have that kind of personality type, that they're drawn to those kinds of communities, it's partly because it is predictable and safe and encouraging, and it gives them a sense of a worldview that embraces more than just this lifetime. But it's really interesting to look at the kind of people that are drawn to even different groups within Protestantism. So I think because there even is not as much openness in some evangelical groups to ecstatic experience as there is in some Eastern Orthodox or some charismatic groups, I think you're going to see that here too. And one of the things that Nathan and I have talked about is how whenever you have unusual experiences, unusual state experiences, those tend to be viewed negatively. They tend to be viewed as that could be Satan parading as an angel of light. We get all these sort of references to scripture that use very creatively to sort of box in that we know exactly what reality is. We know what the options are. We've got humans and animals on the one sort of middle domain. We've got angels and God the Father in heaven. We've got Satan and the demons below. And if anything comes in that's not within the middle domain, it's got to be one of those two others. Like, quite often gets put into those categories. So I think I know so many times in experience or testimony, people who do come from religious circles, right, religious backgrounds, that's one of the things they most wrestle with, is that completely gets rejected almost immediately. They're told they're parading with demons, basically. Even when they have remarkably positive, benevolent experiences, they feel like they change. People see them change in demonstrably positive ways, but it still doesn't fit that expectation. And so they're assumed that they're just basically deceived. So I think that evangelicals will have a huge upswing to go through here, because there's going to be a lot more to ground into their understanding of just the nature of reality and what the possibilities are in terms of non-human intelligence. Of course, even there, I always want to give the caveat that there's quite a range. So I have been speaking with some of my friends that I grew up with that are they would still call themselves evangelicals. And some of them have been surprisingly open-minded. And I'm happy to say that, so I think it really does depend on the person. I think you'll also see kind of while you'll maybe get some initial comments that will sound like it wants to cookie cutter fit it into one of these categories that exist, as time goes on and more people speak up, and as disclosure rolls out, more people will feel authorized to come forward and share their experiences, even people from Christian traditions, then I think there will be this wrestling with and this reckoning with fear and trembling, if you will, what this all means, right? And what does this say about the nature of reality? Now, as you point out, Catholics kind of have already opened up the possibility of other beings from other worlds. Then the question becomes, do they still need a savior? How does that work? How does Jesus being a human, or was he human? Was he a hybrid? These are interesting questions, right, that get brought into the equation. But it seems to me that because, again, the Catholic Church has such a long history, not only in terms of practicing faith and telling people about what faith is and what it should look like, but they've also, more than any other historical institution, been able to see the phenomenon in action, because I would say that somehow it's all connected, right? So they're able to look at someone like St. Francis of Assisi and see how some of the physiological symptoms he went through might be very, very similar to Chris Bledsoe, right? And so what does that say about, did he also encounter orbs? Therefore, what are orbs, right? These are very interesting questions. There are people now that would look back at St. Francis of Assisi and say that he's actually suffering from rheumatoid arthritis, much like Chris Bledsoe. So this raises really profound questions. I think a certain element in the Vatican knows about that. They've known about it all along, and they've actually been prepping for that day much more than evangelicals have been. And that's when you have a centralized authority, you can actually do more planning like that. But I think that they are poised to help the faithful understand that it just means we live in a more awe-inspiring, stellar, kind of interconnected cosmos.
Is St. Francis also a noted freshwater fisherman, just like Chris Bledsoe? So another parallel there.
Exactly. That data point.
Nathan, would you like to take a cut on that question, sir?
Yeah, I think I could give a quick jump in on it. So I agree with Darren in many, many ways here, and I think he would concur with what I'm going to say. And it really comes down to the rigidity of people's narrative framework. And so you can find rigid frameworks both on the right and the left in the Christian tradition. If your evangelicalism is extremely boxed in, that you as Darren mentioned, you're kind of going by the book and the book is everything, then I think you don't have a lot of wiggle room there for any other type of experience to enter into the equation and to challenge you to grow. So instead you're going to do what anyone would do, and you're going to push back against new information and really kind of harden, thicken the shell that you have there against what you're seeing that's taking place. But similarly on the far left, where I think there is a similar kind of narrative rigidity, that reality can only be a certain way, that it's highly logical, highly rational, anything that kind of occurs within experience that is outside of what I've come to believe are the facts about reality, they're going to have a very difficult time with this as well. I think the traditions within Christianity that have the greatest sense of God continuing to do work in the world, that the Spirit of God is alive in community, alive in relationship, that the work of God is not yet finished. Those kinds of believers will have an easier time in some respects dealing with some of these new revelations. But I mean, let's be clear, it's going to be very challenging for anyone that considers themselves to be firmly in that tradition, just like it's going to be challenging for those of us that think we're above all that, that we've left religion behind and we're living in the world of cold rationality and we don't need that stuff anymore. Some of those folks are going to have the hardest time, maybe even a harder time than those who believe.
It's what's interesting, and I don't want to cut you off, Meredith. Did you have something to respond to that, ma'am?
No.
Okay.
I think that both of those answers are fair, because people have a wide spectrum of beliefs within certain traditions. But I think it's just fascinating to compare the two generally, Catholicism versus being a Protestant, because of the Catholic Church's history with, cover up, like the 1904, 1905 crash in Italy and Mussolini and the Vatican and all that stuff. Like, it's just deeply fascinating to me because, while evangelicals have a very much more charismatic framework through which they express, like Darren, you said, the altered states of being, which I attribute my experience in the Assemblies of God Church to my ability to quite easily get into a meditative state. Like, it's not a big deal.
Right.
I'm like clicked in really quickly, really easily, and feel
Right.
A lovely like vibration every time I meditate. And I attribute that to my experience in that sort of atmosphere. So it's interesting, the pros and cons in each camp, if you will, that would allow, that would create like an open door to a first contact versus a closed one.
Right.
Yeah. What's interesting, Darren, if you could help Meredith fill out her application for the Monroe Institute, we can get this taken care of real quickly, get her in, get her through the program, right?
I'd just be happy with a group mushroom trip. Well,
offline, you guys should connect and let Darren tell you about the Monroe Institute, because I don't know a lot of details about it, but I hear it's an amazing experience and very broadening in terms of using meditation and so forth. And Nathan, what's interesting, your first point, I think, is probably for one reason why you're not practicing anymore, is because of that. So, see, I was paying attention. Yep. Anyway, as far as the fireside, who would like to go first? Primetime, would you like to throw your topic out there first, ma'am?
You're putting me on the spot. I've been thinking about what both Darren and Nathan said about religion, and I'm just gonna kind of sidecar onto that and say it reminds me of something we say in data science and AI about how all models are bad, but some models are useful, right? and that, like, we're sort of given there at a certain point. It requires a very substantial degree of intellectual and spiritual honesty about the limitations of our frameworks, whether it's from a strict materialist interpretation of reality or a spiritual approach within the confines of an organized religion and its associated theology and dogma. At a certain point, it feels like these models, we have to be very candid about their edges. And also, I think there's a degree of either maturity or foolhardiness that allows us to kind of step beyond those confines. And I think that's where the really interesting, both personal and shared experiences happen, is when we're sort of willing to unfetter ourselves from the confines of these beliefs or ideologies and be willing to just step into these spaces completely open to whatever outcomes or experiences may exist within them.
Is this is that your topic? Like, do I?
No, I was just kind of responding.
Okay. All right. Because if you want to make that your topic, I'll respond to that if you want. But I don't know.
Go for it, DJ. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
No, if you have a different topic, I won't. You know.
No? I don't. I was thinking. Okay. I was just kind of cogitating.
Yeah, I mean, my thing, we've seen this now that I've got my feet really wet. You don't need to move us around, Nathan. That way I'll be able to keep order of who goes when.
I got you.
So, the Bigfoot topic and obviously us collectively experiencing this UFO topic together and listening to people like Exo and Deb and, Nathan, yourself, even Meredith on her show, it's a very non-judgmental position that she comes from. She doesn't go with an angle. She goes she goes there in, I want to learn about this and deconstruct it and figure it out so that people understand it. Not, hey, this is what I think and I'm going to put my opinion out there and shape this the way I want it to be. So openness is the key. I have put this out there, Leah, to a bunch of friends that are outside of our community. I sent them the video. I sent them the debrief article. I sent them the uncut interview, which was great. Thank you, Technopoodle, for putting that out there. And people have in a lot of cases chosen not to watch it. They'll tell you, "Oh man, I haven't got to it yet." It's only the biggest story of all time, but by all means, pick up your dry cleaning and your Little Caesars. So, it's going to be very difficult from that standpoint. But to me, if you remain open and try to work through these topics, obviously every one of us has a weighted system in our head that we assign a different weighted value to these different hypotheses that we ingest. And then we come out with, okay, yes, this is possible in my weighted system. It's quite low. Over here, this hypothesis is quite high, but I'm open to all of them. I think that's the really, not only is it the safe place to be and the smart place to be, but if you're in the position of saying this is not real, there's no proof of anything, nothing's happened, nothing's happening, then that really isn't the safe or smart place to be. It might make you feel safe, but then if there is an inexplicable if there's an irrefutable, contact event, which, Darren's alluded to, Deb's alluded to, David Grush alluded to that, then you're going to find yourself in a position where you won't feel safe. If seeing a video, and Nathan, if someone sees a video and a photo, they're going to go, oh, well, that could have been faked. So everyone who says they want proof, short of you walking inside the craft and touching the walls and asking whether there's a paper towel dispenser or the little hand dryer, you're not going to get proof ever. Because if there's a photo, you're going to say it's fake. And if there's a video, you're going to say it's fake. It's come from the government. It's got to be fake. They're trying to play with us. So from that standpoint, remain open-minded about all these hypotheses. Obviously, you're going to have a weighted bias. Darren spoke about bias. We all have them. That's why I asked him that question about the different messages he received. Obviously, we all have a bias. When we receive information, some of it we take it and it's going to be more fit into the frame, fit into our value system, and some of it is going to be like, I'm not trying to hear you, debunker jackass. You know what I mean? So it's that's real. So anyway, I hope that sort of answers you, but the openness, I think, is the key aspect. Debs?
I have a hard time thinking of Catholicism as not being open-minded. I was raised Catholic, actually, and frankly, they're so into the paranormal, it's unbelievable. They're the reason we have movies like The Exorcist, so I don't think that that's going to be a problem. There's a reason, Catholics would say God had a son that came to earth because God never was on earth, so I think there's an open-mindedness there already. That's a given. But for some reason, while we were talking about this, what came to mind was maybe the people who are open-minded, who are paying attention, who are picking up that they need to work on their frequencies and all that, are the people who are supposed to be. They're the people who are supposed to be in tune right now. And that maybe other people just aren't there yet. So it is there's some steps that need to be taken for some people, if that makes sense. And that kind of goes to that whole control theory thing, which, I know is going to come up at some point, but that was actually something I will bring up again for my topic also.
Yeah, I was going to say, Dr. Pasulka, whom all of us here have spoken with, wholeheartedly agrees with you on that position about Catholicism and their openness to it, and she thinks religion is integral, necessary, and it's sort of in the right proper place to address a lot of these issues, in her opinion. You got into that with her, Meredith. So
yeah, I did. She was the first person to really introduce the idea to me about the interconnectedness between the things that we traditionally have separate boxes for. I like the analogy of waffles versus spaghetti. And we like waffles, right? There's hard ridges, the syrup stays in its little box, and it's separate. Nothing is touching anything else. But really, life and spirituality and all of these things that we're talking about are much more like spaghetti. They are intertwined, saucy, messy, and if you leave them out on the counter too long, they will all stick together and you'll never untangle them.
I love it. Man, I was thinking about Roscoe's Chicken and Waffles right there. Darren, what's your take on what Primetime had to say?
Well, first of all, I just want to agree with Meredith and echo that again, that was my experience. That I think some of my experiences in charismatic circles in the past actually prepared me for this. And I've seen things that are called different things that are exactly the same thing. So it's interesting how we attach certain labels to the same experience in different traditions. I'd also say that in terms of models that Leah referred to, so my introduction originally to Eastern spirituality came through Thomas Merton. So I was interested in Thomas Merton's writing. Contemplative Christianity was a big thing I moved towards, and then sort of seamlessly made my way over to where there's the bleeding edge that moved into merging with Eastern perspectives. And some of the most ecstatic kind of experiences that various nuns had in history, and people like Thomas Merton that really had this intense numinous experience with the divine. And then you compare that to what people in Eastern traditions experience in terms of the numinous and the connection of everything, you start to have a lot of crossover. And suddenly the terms that we are so attached to in terms of models and whatnot begin to dissolve. And so I would say one of the things that's the best antidote to being too committed to a model is experience, is being open to new experience, to actually introduce yourself to new experience. When you do that, you change. And I think, again, on the not so fun side, you get ontological shock when not only does your model not fit for it, but no model seemingly fits for it. But again, that's how we grow and learn. And I think about someone like Dorothy Izat, for instance, when I sort of connect now models and traditions and our expectations and how that seeds experience. So Dorothy Izat had these amazing experiences. She was in the Vancouver area, and her initial experiences were extremely positive and sort of awe-inspiring. Then she went to her church community, who said, like I've been talking about, unfortunately, they said, that can't be good, that must be demonic. What's interesting is not just that they said that, but she began to believe that, wonder about it at least. And then for the first time, she began to notice shadow beings manifesting in her home. Then she said, wait a second, somehow my energetic resonance is seeding this process in some way. I'm going to go back to my original perspective, which is that there's love and light here. And if I enter into the experience with positive intention to reach out and connect with benevolent beings, then that will be my experience. And sure enough, that's what started happening again. So I know some people will be overwhelmed with the role that we can play in the nature of the experiences we have. So again, I want to suggest spiritual hygiene, energetic preparation, work towards having some sort of energetic immune system, if you will, so that when you enter into these encounters, you have some sort of protection, some sense of what you're reaching out to. But in order to dissolve and expand our models and not be too committed to the models, because the map is not the territory, I think we have to look to experience.
I want to say hello. There's so many of you in the chat. I just, in trying to get it all in, I got to keep going, but we do appreciate you all. I see you, Mick from the UK. I see you, David, and so forth, Anon, and yeah, Duncan. And I know Deanne is in there somewhere. There's Duncan. I got your question up. So discombobulated was a great question. I got to add that to the polysyllabic words that we had tonight. Nathan, what's your take on that, sir?
Yeah, so I'm a, as you know, I'm a very kind of holistic thinker in the way I look at people, and I'm of the opinion that there's something about human behavior and personality that speaks to the heart of reality. And where I'm going with this is there are tendencies within everyone knows people like this. There are people who are the conservative. They don't want to try something new. They don't want to entertain a new experience. Then there are the people who say, sign me up for the new experience. I want to go on the road trip. I want to see everything. We all know people like this, and we know that we ourselves slot into one of those categories. Sometimes we kind of bounce back and forth a little bit. So if we're being really honest, we can recognize that we have at root in the human family these tendencies. And I think these tendencies themselves are at the root of reality. Reality has a desire for sameness, but also a competing desire for novelty. And these two things have an interrelationship. And through relationship, we have beauty and truth and change and progress. And so when looking at it from that vantage point, I can honor where anyone really is in their journey. I can respect where they are in their journey, and I can see that it has value in relationship to where I am, even if I have a totally different opinion about what the nature of whatever it is happens to be. I can see some relational benefit by acknowledging the way that they look at the world. And so there's a pliability there that I think is essential. Everyone here has, I think, touched on that. It's important that we, in a way, kind of keep our beliefs in superposition. And I think that is really just being honest, right? I get so frustrated when people like to say that I'm an X, I'm a Y, I'm a whatever it is. I put a label up and that's who I am. No one is like that. In your mind, you are entertaining a host of possibilities all the time. And it's not until we ask you that one emerges from your awareness and that you bring it into the world. But before that happens, you are in a state of superposition, right? And I'm just using this quantum analogy here because I think folks are hearing it in popular parlance. I think it's a valuable analogy. So I'm just arguing that we need to be open. We need to be also respect where everybody happens to be, and that we can find in the way that in which people are and humanity is, in that relational quality of human existence, we can find that a little kernel of what deeper reality is doing.
In terms of you respecting where people are on their journey, am I included in that? Like, do you?
Absolutely. And that shirt for sure. So that's why I have the black shirt, right? And you've got your amazing shirts. Like, but together, it's beautiful music, man. That's what it's all about. I think we froze him in laughter. He's frozen in carbonite. And I want to screen cap this right now. It's fantastic.
Yeah, he's in memoriam, and that is exactly how we would all think of DJ.
Exactly.
Yes. Just like that with the stars in the background. It's completely perfect.
Absolutely fabulous. All right. Well, while DJ is getting his audio and video worked out, we're going to go ahead and pass the torch over to Deb. I know you hinted a little bit about what you wanted to touch on. So why don't you walk us through it?
Right. So I'm kind of dealing with, of course, the control hypothesis that Valet has mentioned, that basically the phenomenon is putting on a show for us, putting on a play. And the reason this is something that's on my mind is because a lot of experiencers that I talk to feel like they've been put in place like a chess piece. So I wanted to throw that around for people to just contemplate about what that might mean. And I also want to say that there are concerns also that the government is aware that we're chess pieces, and that they might try to manipulate and use that experiencers also, including for, that whole flying the saucer thing that they're having trouble with. So what do you think?
Yeah, that's a good one. Darren, I'd like you to kick this one off for us. I know you got some thoughts on this.
Sure. I think, of course, one of the questions is, if we are pawns within this larger play, how much can we really understand the full picture of what's going on? To what degree, again, someone earlier mentioned humility. I think humility is really, really essential here, not just in terms of understanding whether or not a control system is in play, but again, in terms of our reality models. One of the things I talked about was the extratemporal hypothesis that Mike Masters has brought forward. I had a really great long conversation with Mike on Friday, and we see a lot of the same things in this. And what both of us have been frustrated by is how we've interacted with physicists who are so locked in on their perspective on the nature of how space-time works. And I pointed to people like Nima Arkani Hamed, these cutting-edge physicists who said that space-time is not foundational. In some ways, it's not really a thing. It's part of our perceptual set, but it's not actually indicative of underlying reality. So it just goes to show how little we know. And speaking of Valet that Deb brought up, he was also the one that repeatedly said, the one thing the phenomenon teaches us is that we do not understand space-time. Since then, we've actually learned that space-time is actually not pointing to foundational reality. So then we realize there's a whole substrate that we're not even familiar with yet. So that just shows you how much is in play, the full scope of this. And again, I think some humility is in order, even interdisciplinarily. We need to have humility in terms of how we apply these things. We need to think more as generalists, even in academia, so that we don't sort of lock off into these little subsets and try to become experts in these microcosms when that doesn't really speak to the total reality. We should be speaking to each other. We need to get past this siloing of information and siloing of sort of academic specialties so that we can actually have a conversation and open our minds and increase the extent of our models. In terms of the control system, again, I think my perspective is that we should look to people like Valet and Keel and be thankful for them. But I do tend to notice in the UFO community a bit of like hero worship there, in the same way that we see in religious traditions that people say, well, these people had these amazing experiences, the Abrahams, the Apostle Pauls of the world. That's not me. I'm going just to look at their experience and learn from it. In the same way, we tend to take what was put forward as these cutting edge ideas in the 60s and 70s by people like Valet and Keel. And I still see people sort of leaning on those as the chief hypotheses. I think we have a lot more information now. I think the timepiece is so central, for instance, as well as these other aspects, these other dimensions, these other contact modalities that speak to this broader reality. So I think for me, I'm less attached to the control system thing, actually. I just think that we are part of a really complex, multidimensional array of beings, and that we are somewhere maybe towards the beginning of that in terms of our sophistication. So we tend to, again, in our hubris and some of our bias, we say, well, here we are, we're on the chess set. Actually, what's going on is five-dimensional chess at the very least. And we are so, in some ways, low rung on the ladder that I don't think we're even in a place where we can begin to notice, recognize, and even try to tamper with the control system, as Valet has kind of talked about in terms of going back into the projector screen and see what that's looking at. So I think I would just, again, say humility, resist the what I call this desire to declare that we're at near pinnacle knowledge. I don't think we are at all. I think we have more to learn than we've already learned at this point. And I think that should give us pause about any kind of overarching theory of everything that we would propose at this time.
If you guys can get me caught up on who went, where are we, who's...
Yeah, we went to Deb next, and she put forth the idea of the control hypothesis that Jacques Vallée has talked about. So if you want to take that, you're welcome to. Or...
Well, that was Duncan's question, so that's great. So we already knocked Duncan's question out from the chat, but did Meredith get to go?
Nope.
I wanted
we
to
just started with
clarify.
Darren. Deb, go ahead.
To summarize, it's, are we being manipulated? And if not by non-human intelligence, are we being manipulated possibly by the government to help them with their use of technology from non-human intelligence?
I think David Grush says we're not helping enough. He'd like to see the general, all these folks from universities and that are, in academia that have some of the brightest scientific and engineering minds in the world get a shot at this, and he's irritated that sole source contracts are being given out to whatever company, and we don't have the best people looking at this that could solve a lot of problems, and that was part of his motivation for coming forward among 2 or 3 other things. So that just came to mind. But Meredith, would you like to take that? We'll just go in this sort of counterclockwise circle here.
Yeah, I gotta say, I am not at all familiar with this theory. As someone who is definitely, compared to all of you, generally an outsider to ufology, this is what my husband calls getting into the weeds, right? Of it. Like, he's Southern, can you tell? And so, I just have all my effort is keeping up with the acronym alphabet soup that I find myself swimming in all the time. UAPs, UFOs, arrows, ATIP, it's all of this, and the cast of characters that I have to keep up. I'm just being honest,
It's
right?
true.
Like, I could try to say something really intelligent here, but the truth is I get lost in all of this. So I love what you said, Darren, about keeping that spirit of humility, and with it, to combine it with what you said earlier about the spirit of open-mindedness, much like when you do go into, like, to sit with the plant medicine, that you're not really trying to control it, you're not telling it what it's going to do for you, you're just simply being with it and being kind of with yourself. And so that's definitely my approach to all of this right now. So I don't have any sophisticated theories or comments on sophisticated theories, because I'm just kind of eyes wide open at this point, and also observing those, that someone said this earlier, about those who are not even wanting to take in this information. So I'm kind of like a ultra observer and ultra learner at this point in the game.
Maybe Curiositer could be.
Look at you. Look at
Sounds almost religious. Like you have Inquisitor, then you have Curiositer. I like that. It's good.
Yeah, that's what I call my listeners of my show, because it's Meredith for Real, the Curious Introvert, because I like to be fancy and it has to be such a long episode or a podcast name. So my listeners are curiositors out there in the world, being curious. Yes.
We are petitioning right now, so the dictionary companies to see if we can get that added and get you credited with it. So, Nathan, would you like to take a shot at that, sir?
Yeah, sure. I think it may appear to us like it's a control system, but it's not, right? It's sort of how we're overlaying onto these experiences this notion of control, because control is actually quite familiar to our human experience, a power dynamic, etc. Like, there's always someone trying to control me and inhibit what I can do. And so I think we're just sort of adopting that perspective. I do think, Deb, kind of to some of your point there, those who don't understand what this is have really no other recourse but to go to those who are experiencing this and to try to understand what messages are coming from those who experience this. Now, I know Darren would nod along with this. What goes wrong in this process is that we go to the experiencer and we listen to what they say, and we take that as literal, but we forget that they're contextualizing their experience as they're telling it to us. And so when Chris Bledsoe talks about his experience, you have to know what framework he's coming from to understand why he located his experience within aspects of that framework. You have to kind of piece that apart and look at the deeper level. And I think, Jean Keel does some of this, and Vallée as well, certainly. But I would kind of argue that the government folks maybe aren't as really good at doing that. And instead and a lot of the folks in the UFO community aren't very good at that. As Darren mentioned earlier, we have a lot of this sort of hero worship, and we kind of write these things down that people say, oh, Elizondo said this. Let me put that in the book here, and I'm going to cite that chapter and verse, and I'm going to do my ritual, and that is what the UFO is, right? I think we're missing the point there, that it is a much richer tapestry, and this is going to hit at something that I think we're really going to struggle with, and that's the way that we come about and understand the world right now isn't well suited to what the phenomena really is. And so we're going to have to kind of build from the ground up, so to speak, or reclaim traditions that we have lost in order to best understand what this really is. We've atrophied. That's the best way to put it. We've atrophied in our capacity to understand this, and we're going to have to start working those muscles.
One of the things that Jim Semivan said is that one of the reasons, among probably half a dozen or a dozen reasons the government didn't want to talk about this, is he said they don't understand what it is. And David Grush said that as well in his interview. He said, we don't know what it is. So that, part of the openness is knowing when you don't know, and saying when you don't know. Well, it's not good when that's the government, because as far as a lot of citizenry is concerned, they need to know. So we want answers. We're going to do the Colonel Jessup, I want the truth. All that kind of business, or Tom Cruise rather. So anyway, that's the problem, is they don't know. And let me pass it over to Primetime to entertain that one.
Yeah, sure. I want to comment on something that Nathan said, which is basically how contextualized these experiences are, and how our language is just so poor for wrapping around these experiences and ideas, let alone like just having a cultural dynamic itself that's extremely dismissive of all kinds of numinous experience outside of particular containers, like we've already discussed, mystical, religious, or evangelical settings. And I also think that particularly in like the Western modern tradition and in popular imagination, like scientism and materialism really rules the day. But of course, this is an interpretive framework that's so poorly suited for this subject. And I keep coming back to like Thomas Kuhn and these ideas of like the need for scientific revolutions and just fundamentally how science is done. Going back to what I said earlier about how all models are bad, but some models are useful. Like, again, having the willingness and the humility to genuinely reflect without agenda on the limitations of the Western scientific empirical method. Everything from the reproducibility crisis to just how things are statistically measured and interpreted. Like being very honest about the facilities and functions that we have for sort of documenting and framing our experience, and then also understanding that this entire method, this whole framework, is so poorly suited to capture and understand like open dynamic systems, which is where we are, right? We're situated in a complex system. This is not a closed container with transactional events occurring. And this is like, when I keep coming back to this subject and kind of reworking it internally and intellectually, this is what I keep coming back to, is that at a sort of basic level, how we approach and understand and interpret our reality is just poor suited for anything that is not in a totally controlled environment. And that's just what I keep coming back to with this subject. And as for government knowledge. I mean, my general personal opinion is that the government is probably about as clueless as the average other people who are invested in this subject. I'm generally more of the opinion that when it comes to institutions kind of holding cloistered knowledge, I'm more inclined to see the Catholic Church as something of an institution of record on this subject, given their long history, their academic and interdisciplinary work, and also their ability to basically function in a more clandestine fashion than I think a lot of the public institutions are able to.
People are like, what? The Vatican?
Yeah, I know. Jesus, listen to me. I've been saving this up for like an hour and a half.
No, I want to say, Primetime, what you made me think of there is something. Frank posed this question on Twitter, an open question to Twitter this week. Frank is our other cabbie from England. And there is no framework. There's no box. And humans don't do well when we don't have a framework and we don't have to have a box and we have to figure it out together. And we just don't have this compartment. People, they're going to try to put it in a compartment. Probably going to, it's going to be square peg, round hole, possibly. So I'm with you on that. But let's go to Meredith and her topic, please.
I would love to talk about what you mentioned in, I think it was Becoming Who We Are podcast, Darren. You talked about a professor friend of yours in Montana thinks that the grays are us 10,000 years from the future. And if we continue on this evolutionary path, that was not anything I'd ever heard before. And so I would love to hear everyone's thoughts on that to kind of expand on that.
Well, guess what? The first one that's going is Darren. And by the way, we will get Michael Masters for your podcast. But anyway, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm actually doing the podcast this weekend for Point of Convergence on this topic as well, because not only is I think there's a lot of relevant data historically that when we see it in the correct light, there's a lot of support for this notion in terms of a hypothesis. In fact, when I look at it now, again, I see kind of a bias that we have not seen it beforehand, that it's not been one of the most predominant kind of paradigms. Usually the extraterrestrial and the interdimensional, the ultra-terrestrial. Sorry, Meredith, I'm throwing some more deep in the weeds terms to you there.
Hey, I have a list of words that I have to go look up after this anyway, so we might as well just add them to the list. It's cool.
That's right. Yeah. But yeah, so Mike has put forward this notion of an extratempestrial. So rather than extraterrestrial, where the notion is they're outside of the Earth, temp as in temporal, right? So they're outside of our time frame, basically, is the notion. So extratempestrial, add it to your list. In fact, he doesn't just say that they are right. What's interesting is it's not just that they are us from 10,000 years in the future, but if time travel becomes a thing at some point, and there's lots of reason to believe it will. Number one, because there's nothing really in physics that would suggest it can't happen, and we already understand sort of theoretically how it would happen. And humanity tends to go through life in such a way that when we can do something, we will do it. We won't even think much about the consequences, right? We will just do it. So what he's actually suggested is even the different forms we see over time are not actually necessarily beings coming from different planets, but different versions of humanity along the evolutionary trajectory. So some are much further along than others. So you'll get some, like the Space Brothers, for instance, are beings that come back and look a lot like us. So they might be from not too far ahead on the evolutionary path. You get other ones that look quite divergent from us. Those would be much, much further along. And those ones that are further along and look more different than us also tend to have greater capacities telepathically, their psi capacities, their psi abilities, their ability to manipulate space-time, their ability to control behavior. All that becomes increased over time, which is what you would expect in terms of an evolutionary trajectory. So I think there's a lot of support for that in the historical data. And when you think about it in terms of what is the least complex way of explaining that, what's interesting with Mike's hypothesis, and he wasn't the first one to champion it, but because he's a biological anthropologist, he's uniquely qualified to notice that when he looks at a gray alien and a modern Homo sapiens sapien, he sees beings that are undoubtedly related, genetically related. We also hear hints about the Roswell crash might have involved bodies that had genetic aspects that were in common with us. So again, you see it in the literature when you look for it. Some people have suggested even that the reason why the secret's been kept so long is because they're not actually space aliens, this one contingent, but actually us from the future. And then you perhaps have, getting back to a really big open-ended answer here in terms of how the government might be involved, how we might be pawns. If some people within the government, for instance, are aware that they are us from the future, and there's this awareness that if there was too much widespread of acknowledgement of that, then that might change the trajectory of the timeline, then you could feasibly consider ways that you might want to keep that secret for the sake of the good of humankind, kind of thing. And you might also buy into this notion that these others that come back and say, turns out in the future, we are genetically impoverished, we've taken some wrong turns, we need actually to refresh the pool by going back to our ancestors, getting increased genetic variance and inputting it back into the population in the future for the health of the stock, basically. And you might say, well, we're all one big crew here, and so therefore we're willing to do it. If you're a military group, you might justify doing that even more so if you're promised technology in exchange for these kinds of things. So somehow you see different elements of the historical narrative, and somehow a lot of it can wrap itself around, somehow attached to this notion that they are us from the future. Again, I think it's much more complex than that. I think that there's been evidence of perhaps splicing of other kinds of genetic backgrounds. They often look very insectoid. You kind of get the reptilian aspect. Again, these are beings common to the earth already. So you could actually limit your scope to just earth tradition and earth origin and end up with all of these forms we're seeing if you bring in time travel. So, and of course, if it's time travel and it's in the future, then by then they probably have populated the cosmos. They probably are at Zeta Reticuli, perhaps. That doesn't mean that's their origin, though. So I think it's a really compelling argument. The longer I've really sat with it and looked at the data, and even some of the stuff I've heard coming out of the intelligence community in terms of what they're aware of this being part of the equation. And again, this notion of like somehow maybe they're perhaps here to do with some sort of cataclysm that's coming and trying to change the eventuality of that based on tweaking the timeline in such a way that you don't cause too much change, but just enough to perhaps prevent that. There perhaps even being different factions with different agendas. When we think about humanity today and how divided we are and how we have very different ways of seeing the world and different ways of conducting our affairs, suddenly if we consider these beings being something like us, but just from the future, then it's easier for us, I think, to entertain the notion that they would have different factions, different agendas, different ways of seeing the world even. That's my 2 cents.
I love it. I used to think string theory was like a concept that smart people entertain themselves with on their downtime. But now I feel like I need a crash course in it just to be prepared for whatever's coming next through the news.
Right.
Yeah, I guess I'll go next. Each, I think you're on mute. Still, nope.
Michael Masters is so entertaining. You would love to have him on your podcast. He's so funny, and he'll throw some 4-letter words in there for a PhD. It's funny. But Nathan, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I mean, Darren, I couldn't do a better job of explaining that theory than you just did. I would add, and I think you hinted at this, that the data suggests that there are a lot of other entities as well, and entities that maybe are non-corporeal. Can't get that
There you
word
go.
out.
You got it.
Yes,
Corporeal.
thank you.
Yeah.
Corporeal. That may be, and we've heard this, right? We've heard that there are beings of light, and that you can find those examples throughout human history. In fact, so there may be types of intelligence that aren't necessarily genetically human or have a human lineage, and exist in different areas or planes of reality than what we exist in. And they too maybe have an approach to messing with things that might be different than what the human tendency would be. So you can imagine, as this gets more and more complex, with perhaps different human lineages competing and trying to do different things, and different entities which are not human that have competing priorities as well, you can see how the interplay of all these kinds of beings might result in some of the odd things that we have heard recounted. I think it's a compelling hypothesis. It's also one of those things like time travel where it just kind of can drive you crazy. It's like, well, if we introduce time travel in a TV show, I always get sort of frustrated because it feels like this like ridiculous MacGuffin that just sort of explains every problem that the show encounters. So I don't like it for that reason. Maybe TV has ruined it for me, but I do like it for its explanatory power. So.
He said that to Kelly Chase today. He said that Back to the Future ruined it for everybody. I was listening today. It's ironic that we're Michael Masters heavy, and I just heard him today. But we're going to have to be relatively concise in our answers here because we're going to be coming up on 2 hours here fairly shortly. So Primetime, go ahead, ma'am.
One of the things I'm really curious about and I'd love to hear people's thoughts on is how much of this subject is basically an artifact of modernity versus how much is something that has existed alongside humans basically since time immemorial. And I say this because, granted, we're in the thick of it right now, but it sometimes feels as if we're in some sort of acceleration period between the psychedelic renaissance and sort of the rise in this I would say like unlabeled spirituality and sort of the openness to subjectivity and qualitative experience. And also kind of, I don't want to call it a regression, but sort of almost existing in something of a post-truth era in a lot of respects. And so I'm wondering what the thoughts are on how much of this, when I talk about the phenomena, how much of this has been with us for a long time, and how much of it we think is an artifact of modern human experience.
Well, one thing is we didn't get you to react to the question that Meredith had, and then we'll entertain
Sorry.
yours. So
I'm like front running this.
Did you have anything on Michael Masters real quick? I'll react to it real quick, and then we'll move on to your question.
Sure. Sorry. Go ahead. I don't have any response to Michael Masters, unfortunately.
Oh. You and
know,
no coffee
for shame.
you too. No coffee for you too. But hell, you're in Idaho. You could see Dr. Jeff Meldrum and see his Bigfoot footcast collection at Idaho State. Anyway, yeah, my take is, Meredith, I try to distill everything down to very simple terms so that somebody like me who's watching or listening can sort of have a way to take in this information and find, a way that they, at least one avenue to look at it. So, I've said this, before before we interviewed Dr. Masters, Nathan and I and Deb talked about this, and I just said, if I can't know why that an intelligence would want our biology, but I do know that they find an importance in it. I just don't know what that is. I can hypothesize about what that is, and we can speculate, and that's great because that's what we have fun doing here. But there's no question that they find a value in it. Otherwise, they wouldn't be taking it from all these experiencers. We can also look at cattle mutilations. And one of the interesting things that Darren brought up real quickly is he mentioned mantids and insectoids and stuff, right? And reptilian types. So it's very obvious when a farmer loses a piece of his stock and there is some surgical laser-like cut on areas with no blood on areas of this cattle that get everybody's attention. But who is going to notice if something like that were to happen to a reptile or to an insect that they have then used, as Darren was talking about? Maybe they have harvested their DNA as well. For what reason? I don't know, but he said, as you said, Darren, they could be coming other species from this planet that some of the intelligences that reportedly it looks like them. That could be why. We haven't figured out why David Paulides had these workers pick up a moose in the middle of a field, and this UFO literally like drug it on. I don't know if you guys saw that, but levitated it up and took it off somewhere. And so for what reason, we don't know, but they find value in it. It's just we can only speculate, but it is very, very interesting to say the least. So now, can you just hit the last part of your question, Primetime?
I'll hit Deb wanted a quick. She wanted to jump in real quick. I want to give Deb an opportunity.
Yeah, I wanted to answer also because I don't take anything off the table when it comes to the phenomenon, which is a really broad term because there's so many things going on. So I've also considered how our technology is rapidly approaching what people are describing when they talk about UFOs, when they talk about entities. We have created biological robots. We are already coming up with the idea of incubators for humanity, like that we don't have to make our children anymore. They're already doing CRISPR technology. Other countries are not as ethically bound as ours and are probably doing things that we don't even know about already. And when it comes to things like going into space, we're like, oh, no one else would do that, but we're doing it. So I think if you just follow the path of what we have done, then we can't rule out future human hypothesis. So that's what I wanted to add to that.
Deb, thank you so much. I'm sorry, I forgot that you hadn't gone yet, so I apologize about that. Anybody who wants to see people creating something in our image, go check out Robert Hansen of Hansen Robotics. I think it's in Hong Kong or something, where he created like a little robotic daughter and is playing the piano in his apartment, and it looks basically like a little Chinese girl. And it is real, and he refers to this robot as his daughter, and it is extremely creepy. So that goes along with what you said, Deb. Okay, so if you could just hit up that last part to contextualize your question, just reiterate it real quick, the last part there, prime time.
Yeah, I was really asking for people's thoughts on how much of this phenomena is an artifact of modernity, right? Like how much of it is something that's emerging with greater frequency or greater intensity or more popularly in our current moment, or if it's something that has existed, I would say, with the same degree of intensity over time and has not substantially changed over the last, let's say 80 years.
Well, the same. I'll take this first. It's going to go again counterclockwise. It can't have happened with the same degree of intensity because we didn't have a 24-hour news media. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have all these tools to talk about it. But the scrawlings on the cave walls, the Native American drawings on their hieroglyphic symbols or whatever that they have drawn, the artwork that is from many, many years ago that show saucer-like objects. So I think it's always been there. The fact that we're talking about it more is part of modernity, but I don't think it has anything to do with it's more or less real now because of the fact that we have this, we're able to sit there in 5 different places and have a video conversation, and we have the internet. So, no, I think it's always been there, and it's just something that we're coming to grips with because we have this increased communication. It's not only reading one another's books and so forth, but it's a lot of conversation that's happening electronically that we couldn't have done before. When I was growing up, I mean, you could not have had the conversations that we're having today because Twitter didn't exist. This didn't exist. So I think that's all it is. And it's just, it's going to be very, very difficult for a lot of people to come to terms with this. We are living in a bubble. We have the blessing tonight to have somebody like Meredith who lives outside the bubble, but she's found the access door and she's ducked her head in there and she's kind of looking around. She closed it behind her. She's going to have a conversation and then leave the bubble and then leave the crazies that are us to talk about it the rest of the week. So anyway, that's how I see it, prime time. Debs.
Okay, so I actually think the reason we're able to broach this subject and become more open to it and spiritual with it and all of those things now is because we are so, like, generally speaking, I can't say this for every country or every population, but we're at a point now where we have the room to do that again. Because initially there were, grave concerns about our species staying alive and technology wasn't really around to help us. We were kind of more concerned about getting food on the table, so to speak. Like now people still have to do that, but they're also a lot more comfortable in ways that they take for granted. So they have room to sit down and read a book and, contemplate. And we do also have all this information that's available to us now. So I think the combination of just being more secure in our situation on the planet and also having all of that information available so quickly and easily has taken us to this next level.
Interesting. Miss Meredith.
That is an interesting perspective, Deb, because I was just imagining in my mind, like, calling all beings, but in a country where maybe they don't have as much food security. Like, what would that be happening? What would the conversation be like? What's what's a different version of what this is, but with different needs met or not met? So yeah, I don't know. I don't think I have a comment on it, but just a continuing thought that will trail this evening, I'm sure.
Darren.
Well, the first thing I want to say, I think a couple of people have already hinted at this, but I want to reiterate again that my perspective is that this is much more than one thing, much more than one origin source. And I think what's interesting to do is to consider the totality, but also to look for patterns within the overarching data and look for times where perhaps there have been specific historical moves amongst one contingent of what we call the phenomenon colloquially. So I think, for instance, with the data that John Mack gathered in the 90s to do with the experiencer literature, the abductees, part of the hybridization program, there was a very specific intent and endeavor there that had a certain methodology it followed and seemed to be pursuing a certain kind of program. That might be very different than fairies from fairy lore, right? Might be a very different group altogether. People like Jacques Vallée, again, don't want to beat on Jacques because I love Jacques, but one thing I will say is sometimes people read Passport to Magonia and they go, oh yeah, these are just the same beings across time. We just contextualize them differently based on our cultural milieu and whatnot. I think that's part of it, but I'm not convinced that fairies and elves are gray aliens or future humans or whatever you want to call them. I know that my friend Stuart Davis once suggested this idea to me, and I thought it was a great point. He said that imagine that you have kind of a crocodile come into a bay, and then 1,000 years later you have a canoe being rowed by someone come into the bay, and then 3,000 years later you have a nuclear submarine come into the bay. You could make the argument, this is the same phenomenon manifesting with different guises, right? Or you could just say, no, it's three different entities, different origin sources altogether. So I think we have to be careful not to conflate and collapse because we have this tendency as a culture to reduce to simplicity all the time. I think it's complex. I think there is something happening, to answer Leo's question, there is something happened historically. I think that I know experiencers who were part of the abduction phenomenon in the 90s who didn't hear anything from the others for 20 years, basically. And it's kicked up again the last couple of years, really, really intensely. And that the messages coming through are that what's happening now in our world is directly connected to what was happening in that program. And that the concerns they had about the way that we were treating the earth and whatnot that were voiced in the 90s, even to the kids in Zimbabwe, is only 1,000 times worse now. And so this sense of, I even recently read about some of these kids that are now adults will say, sure enough, the things they predicted and warned us about, we have gone further along that trajectory. And so I think that is actually something that is happening in modernity in our time. That's a unique pattern within the overarching pattern. And I just think, again, we want to stay open-minded. We want to not conflate and collapse the data because I think there's many things going on.
And I just want to say before Nathan goes, I agree with you on the multiple source hypothesis of different phenomenon reacting with different people, different agendas. When I say I try to dumb it down, I meant that one that one hypothesis about future humans. If there's somebody like me out there, if they hear Michael say extraterrestrial and they're like, so I just try to break it down that way. It seems like they want our DNA, but I agree with you. And the multi-source, that's how I felt as well. Can't try to pin this down because you're probably going to be wrong. Nathan, sir.
Yeah, I mean, the irony is not lost on me that we are having a virtual conversation around a virtual fire, and you can easily imagine it's not real. Those who aren't seeing what we're seeing, and you're just listening, we have a fire that's on the screen with us here. But this is something that humans have done for a very long time with a real fire at night as the sun goes down and we're looking at the heavens above. We are sharing ideas and theories and experiences that we've had as we've gone out into the wider world, and we've come back. We've coalesced around that fire to share those stories and to broaden our understanding of what the world is. And so I think that it's interesting. We're doing this now. It's exciting. I would also say that I'm going to use a kind of a crude analogy, and Darren and I talked about this a few weeks ago. That as the information density gets thicker, richer, ever present, think of it as a whirlpool. And if you've ever, when you were a kid, maybe you took a bath and you drain the water out of the bathtub, you kind of watch as the water just sort of spirals down the drain and it forms this cool funnel, right? As the water, gets close to the center of that funnel, it cycles around faster and faster and faster and faster. If you were to go into the experience of a water droplet that went from the outer rim of the funnel to the inner rim of the funnel as it's going down that singular drain, its experience is changing. On the outer rim, it's a very slow experience. I'm looking at this bathtub and not much is changing and everything is kind of moving along. And then over time, it gets a little bit faster. I'm getting more information coming at me faster and faster and faster as I get close to this density of information, this singularity, if you will. My viewpoint, my experience is rapidly changing so that it feels like, this isn't the same reality. Like it's all this crazy jumbled up mix, but it really is the same reality. It's just that our vantage point, our awareness of it is now condensed in this way. And so I would argue that in some respects, that's kind of where we are. And that the things that we are seeing and experiencing are indicative of that point in this sort of evolutionary trajectory or experiential trajectory, whichever terminology you may want to use there. This is what it would look like as we get close to that point of convergence.
Yeah, look at that. Drop that microphone, baby.
Stuck the landing.
Woo! Great question, Prime Time. Obviously very thought-provoking. We expect no less from you. And what did this gentleman say here? Yes, all earthly material believe phenomena is coming from different realms. Yeah, so we believe, brother.
DJ, I'm cognizant of the time. I would wonder if we can try to maybe just do a quick roundabout and
let's do it.
Close it out. So I would like, I don't want to interrupt you, but I know we're getting close to the 2-hour mark here. So
no, I mean, my question for you guys was real simple. I think everybody can answer this very quickly. And we could start. It kind of leans into some stuff that you've said and Debs have talked about. And Grush alluded to it. Darren alluded to it tonight. Is that possible contact event that's coming? And that's one of the reasons that he said he did this. Among the illegality, the immorality, and then the not stated but is in the IG complaint about the coercion. Harassment, intimidation, these types of things that we didn't get to hear him say, but they're reportedly part of the complaint. However, what my question is if that contact event happens, at least 5 of us on the screen, if not 6 now, with Meredith taking this topic on her show on 7 or 8 occasions now. And you go out in your neighborhood and there is that craft that is hovering above and people are exiting their houses and in your case, their cabins, EXO. And they're, they're going to look for answers. People are going to be frantic. So my question to you, Debs, is what do you say to those people? Because you're going to, be a subject matter expert among that group. If there is such a thing, but you know what I mean.
And where to start? I mean,
what do you say to people?
Well, that's what I have to think about, right? I haven't actually thought about that ahead of time. But what I would say, honestly, the first thing that came to mind was light, sound, frequency. Like that to me is so important. And like I think as soon as I know, I can't help it. I feel like, okay, we just need to get you caught up on some technology here. We need to get you go calm down. It's okay. And honestly, I think the biggest mistake that was ever done with this topic is to not normalize it. And I think that if we overreact, and it will make people freak out, but if we go, oh yeah, well, that's nature, let's normalize it. Let's look at the science. Let's look at the history. Let's get you caught up. I think people will be able to adapt. Like we adapt to things that are, really bizarre all the time. I was thinking when we were talking about future humans, how we look at stars that have been dead for how many years, and we just normalize that they're dead things in the sky that we just look at all the time that are from the past. So I think we just need to normalize it for them so they don't freak out.
I was picturing you running underneath, doing the hands out to the side, kind of a Travis Walton, waiting for the tractor beam to come down, but that's okay. Anyway, let's make this a quick hitter. Meredith, this happens in your neighborhood. What do you say?
I shamelessly promote calling all beings because surely we will interview one of the aliens. Obviously.
Oh my God. Oh, thank
Checks
you.
in the mail.
Tune in, everyone. Tune in. That's what I would say.
I appreciate that. Next week, this gray reptilian on Calling All Beings. Darren, what do you say?
Well, I think Nathan and I addressed this recently, the fact that those of us intimately familiar with this, and Meredith might have more of a feeling of what it's like to try to incorporate so much of this so quickly. But many of us who've been years at this, at least since the 2017 revelations, for instance, we've had a lot of time to internalize and metabolize this. And we sometimes, I think, have to stop ourselves and think back about the process and how I mentioned how we kind of go through different phases of actually being able to normalize this and metabolize this. And you kind of have to go through each step. You can't leap ahead. You can't go to your neighbor and say, actually, ultra-terrestrial. And they're like, what? What is that? What even is that? And why not space aliens? There's so many steps in the process in the data that suggest this rather than that. And maybe it's many things. Again, I think what will be ontologically shocking and discombobulating to people twice, that's good, is that it's not just one more thing added to our understanding of reality. It's a complete rewrite. It's like ripping the rug out from underneath them. So it's going to be a lot to metabolize. It's going to be it's going to be an event like no other in the history of the world. And I think to a large extent, many of the others have known that, and that's why they've kind of been slow. This is kind of like the slow boil thing of slowly introducing people to these notions over time. There's been more and more telepathic communication amongst the world. I think whenever we have experiencers glean certain notions about this, it becomes part of the collective unconscious we all can draw from. So somehow, even if we're not always conscious of it, we are normalized to this so that when it finally does happen, we can grapple with it and we can grok it. But I think we just need to remember that when we go speak to our neighbors, they're starting at level 1, not level 7. And we have to talk to them in a way that they can understand.
Nathan, you walk outside the house. The craft is there. Your neighbors are looking up. They're freaking out. What do you say?
Be present, right? I think I say, just be present to the experience. Like a child, right? Everything that happens in the child's life, when it's very little is new and fresh, but you don't see the child, recoiling in fear at the world around it. It's just sort of kind of waiting for an interpretation. It's waiting for its mother or father or caregiver to say it's okay and to normalize whatever that is. So in some respects, that's kind of what Deb is hinting at there. But I would encourage a childlike interaction there. But also, I think it's important, and Darren touched on this quite a bit. Several of us have that it's important to use discernment as well, right? I think there's a part of us, a deep layer of us that is connected to this. And we intuitively understand that and know that. And so I think listen to that part because it's the part of us that isn't constrained by the way we're taught that things are true or real in the world now. And it's that quiet voice that we do listen to many times to make big decisions in our lives, who our partner is or what career we might pursue. So I think kind of listen into that and discern what is going on in that space, and you'll be okay.
I love it. Primetime, you've just exited the ski lift. You flipped your hair back. You haven't yet gone to the black diamond slope and headed down, so you're still sort of atop the mountain. The craft is hovering above the exit of the ski lift. What do you say to people?
I would say, very similar to Nathan, to remain open-minded and also to be deeply skeptical and thoughtful about believing anyone who thinks they have the answers.
Fair
I think
enough.
That would be it. Yeah.
Fair enough. I mean, I'm thinking a lot more in the moment than how you guys answered that. You guys answered it in a sort of philosophical way. I was thinking what you actually would say if this happened, and it was more. And
I'd be shouting at the flying saucer, just like, take me away. Let's go.
And Dad would be trying to shove you out of the way. But no,
does it cover it? I got a lift ticket. Does that mean I get to go?
Yeah.
Show that lift.
I would use an unlimited pass.
I would not shove anybody. I've already offered to go pick everybody up when I get one.
Thank you, Debs. I'm just kidding. No, I mean, I would think I would be honestly just trying to, I would probably be as terrified as everybody else there, but just trying to say, stay calm and, that kind of thing, trying to calm people down and just act like, I was really calm about it, but certainly I would be terrified and just, getting people to understand that not necessarily something negative is going to happen just because they're here. And
if I could add one really fast thing, it's that we can actually prepare ourselves. We can meditate on that moment and how you'd respond. You don't have to wait for the day it happens. And I would actually encourage people to meditate on that because you'll be much better equipped when it actually happens.
I'll do that myself. Thank you for saying that. Let's go with Cabby Goodbyes, starting with Meredith, please.
Cabby Goodbye. What is Cabby Goodbye?
So Cabby Goodbyes is basically where you say goodbye to Darren. And then we'll go around. All of us will say goodbye and basically thank Darren for joining us this evening.
Yes. Thank you, Darren. It was truly a pleasure. I thoroughly enjoyed cyber stalking you, and I can tell you did not disappoint.
Thank you. That's good to know. These are things I really worry about. So thank you.
I love it. Prime time.
Yeah, look, this was a pleasure. I was introduced to your work back in October at the New York event. And have been a big fan ever since. Really appreciate the time sitting down to talk to you. Just a lovely conversation. Thanks, Darren.
Thank you.
Debs.
I just want to thank you for helping us with ontological shock and being discombobulated. We appreciate it so much. Liminally.
Your
Incredible.
brother, Nathan. Yes, just Nathan, before you go, we had interdisciplinary, we had metabolized multiple times by multiple people, extraterrestrial, ultra-terrestrial, and non-corporeal. So this was an amazing, and discombobulated. So this was...
Let us not forget multi-perspectival.
That's true. Multi-perspectival. Oh my gosh, incredible.
Awesome. And Primetime, I feel like we're colleagues, but man, when you put the glasses, like we're on the same intellectual level, then when you put the glasses on, man, you're way above me.
Right?
I'm like down here looking up. Anyway, go ahead, Nathan.
Yeah. Hey, Darren, it's been great. I appreciate the work that you do and your willingness to come on our show and have this conversation. I think it's a sort of side of your commentary that folks don't necessarily get to hear. I think it's added some real value, and we look forward to having you back again in the future. So thanks.
I would just like to say that speaking of spawn, if it were not for a calling of all beings, liminal frames would not exist, correct? I mean, it's because I met Nathan on this show early on when you guys were still talking about NBA and MMA or something.
That's right.
We actually spawned this idea of liminal frames. So thank you for that. We are happy grandchildren.
I didn't know what I was going to change the name to. I knew I was going UFOs and I was putting MMA and NBA and other stuff aside. And so once Nathan joined up, he's the one who came up with this incredible name. We actually had a whole election night built around this. It was really funny. We had two names, and Nathan's was far and away the best one. And it really does fit. Just that's why I call him Money. When he comes up with this, and I sorry that we waited so long to have you on because you've shown just how much fun you are tonight, Darren, and thank you so much. It is an honor to speak with you. I know Nathan and you speak all the time and get to have coffee because you guys live near one another. I'd love to hear that keg party happens with Pasolka, you, Micah Hanks, and like I said, maybe even Chris Bledsoe will come up. And I thank you. I look forward to speaking with you again. So on behalf of Meredith and Leah, Debs, Money, Nathan, this is DJ saying peace out, one love. We'll see you down the road. And as always, we're wondering what's up around the bend.